Which is the world-famous London Palladium Theatre, of course, where Scrooge is now the main attraction. In the 1960s, a famous television show was done from here, called Sunday Night at the London Palladium. It's the most watched shows on British TV at that time. The Beatles first appeared on the show September the 13th, 1963. The show got a huge audience that night. That particular Palladium show is perhaps more famous for the scenes outside the theatre. As virtually the whole day, the theatre was surrounded by Beatles fans, screaming at the tops of their voices. Their favourite group were inside. Actually, girls have been screaming at the Beatles for a long time. It's the first time, though, it happened in central London, right in front of the noses, the national newspapers, who before this hadn't written about the Beatles, or for that matter, pop music in general. Pop music wasn't deemed important enough to write about in newspapers then, because the Beatles really changed attitudes. The next day, the Beatles and their fans are front page news in virtually every British newspaper. So for that reason, lots of people have said that Beatlemania started here at the London Palladium. Well, actually, it's the first time been written about, not the first time it actually happened. In fact, the term wasn't used for another couple of weeks. Here's a picture of the Beatles coming out of the Palladium after the show, coming down the steps here, looking rather startled, all the attention they're getting. The guy in the middle here is Neil Aspinall, their road manager at the time. Neil has been employed by the Beatles since 1961, and still is now. He's now the managing director of Apple, their company, looks after all their business affairs. Been there for over 40 years, and still is now a very loyal servant. Here's a picture of the scenes outside the theatre, another occasion the Beatles played here. All the people on the street that day. Well, it's only 3 days after that first Palladium show, the Beatles are back on the front pages of the papers, when it was announced going to top the bill on the Royal Command performance. That year to be held at the Prince of Wales Theatre, in front of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. Of course, being a royal occasion, it was very high class, and the very rich were able to afford the very high priced tickets. It's at that very high-class occasion that John Lennon decided to make a rather cheeky social comment. When introducing the next song, he asked the audience's help. He said to them,
"For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. But the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewellery."
Well, a thing to say in front of the royals, John. Luckily, John got away with it. So the Beatles are presented to the Queen Mother afterwards. She asked Paul McCartney what the Beatles are playing next. To which Paul replied, "We're playing in Slough." The Queen Mother was delighted. She said to Paul, "Oh, that's near us." So they're staying at Windsor Castle at the time, just down the road from Slough. Regrettably, she didn't go to the Slough concert. At least she showed an interest, I suppose. This is a picture of the Beatles with the Queen Mother at that Royal Command performance. On another occasion, though, John Lennon made a comment he did not get away with, and how. And part of that interview took place in the building next door, which is Sutherland House. It's at the office building above the bar next door. It's where Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, located his London offices. Of course, the Beatles gave many interviews there, including this one that John partly gave to Maureen Cleave, that Evening Standard newspaper, in February '66. Maureen spent a whole day with John, both at his home in Weybridge. At the end of the interview, here at Brian's offices. The interview was called How Does a Beatle Live? During this interview, John was talking about his opinions on religion. What he's trying to say, I think, was that church attendances are falling alarmingly in England, especially amongst young people. The young people seem much more interested in going to concerts and buying records than going to church. So John said in the interview, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus Christ. Oops. Not the best way of putting it, John. Left the Beatles out of it, people might have got what he was talking about. This interview appeared in the London papers, though, and anyone took much notice. But starts only a couple of lines in a very long interview. People did notice it. Lots of people agreed with John. Especially for England, at least, that church attendances were falling. It's a real crisis in the Church of England at that time. But a few months later, the interview reappeared, an American fan magazine called Datebook. Rather changed the whole meaning of the interview, headlining the whole thing. Now John Lennon says, Beatles are bigger than Jesus Christ. In other words, better. Well, that really caused trouble. Radio stations banned Beatles records from being played. A few of the more radical ones organised big fires so people could come and burn their Beatles records and memorabilia. This is just before they're due to arrive in America for a concert tour. That tour only went ahead when John was forced to apologise for his comments, the first press conference in Chicago. But still there were demonstrations outside the concerts, and by the likes of the Ku Klux Klan. The Beatles received death threats too. But it's only a very small minority that really cared what John said. They had huge crowds at each concert. In those days, of course, they're playing an outdoor football or baseball stadium, sometimes in front of 50,000 people. The trouble is that the stadium didn't have the technology to cater for the music. The music was rather quiet. The same can't be said of the fans. The fans went to scream, and scream as loud as they could. And quite often the noise of the screams would drown out to the noise of the music, so no one could hear a thing. In fact, sometimes they just couldn't hear themselves play. That caused a strange thing to happen. This came on stage after a concert, and Paul McCartney turned to Ringo Starr and said, "Your drumming is a bit strange on that last song, what were you doing?" And Ringo said, "I was playing this song as usual, what was wrong?" And Paul said, "Don't you remember? We didn't play that song tonight." But Ringo said, "Well, I did." He'd forgotten they'd changed songs. But Ringo couldn't hear the announcement that Paul made. Not going to hear the other Beatles are playing. If he couldn't hear anything, no one else could hear anything either. But not surprisingly, with all this going on, they fed up with playing concerts. Decided enough is enough, got their last proper show at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, August the 29th, 1966. Just confined themselves to the recording studio after that. With one exception, of course, at the last ever live performance, a certain rooftop, not that far away from here. It's the next place you're going to see on the tour. Bit of a postscript to Bigger and Jesus controversy though. One of the first radio stations organised a Beatles burning was one in Texas. The day after the burning, the radio station was struck by lightning and put off air for several hours. The station controller knocked unconscious. Quite a coincidence, really. We'll give you some time, I'd like to take some pictures here. Let's see their famous rooftop concert. But that way in a moment. Give you time for pictures here first.